$32,000. That was the figure that shook up the Brown family. A secret debt, attached not to a business venture, not to subsistence, but to decisions Robyn had made in silence. And when the secret was discovered, the family was left wondering, how do you trust someone who's been hiding behind secrets this large? But what makes this tale so explosive is not the cash itself. It's what it uncovered about betrayal, loyalty, and a failing family dynasty. Because when the wives discovered Robyn's debt, everything they believed about their financial future came crashing down. And if you find that astonishing, just wait until you hear what happened next. Back in the beginning, money was already a thin thread keeping the Brown family together. With 2 homes to keep up, never-ending bills piling up, and the constant worry of transplanted lives from state to state, every single dollar counted. There were compromises at every turn. Kids waiting for new shoes, dinners served on tight budgets, and visions of stability perpetually slipping just beyond reach. But behind it all, Robyn bore something more weighty than she ever told anyone. It wasn't merely the tension of becoming part of a plural marriage, or the stress of dealing with delicate relationships. It was something she bore silently from her own past. Something she told herself she didn't need to vocalize. It was history, to her. A mistake. A wound that did not define her future. But debts don't just disappear, because love assures you they will. They don't evaporate with promises or with time. They lurk in the dark, getting heavier the longer they're pushed aside. And although no one else in the family was aware of this, Robyn's silence was creating the conditions for a storm that would rock the very foundations of their trust. The revelation didn't arrive in the form of loud voices initially. It arrived with documents, cold, impersonal, and irrefutable. Laid out on the table, the figures glared back like a gashed open wound. $32,000 in debt. The wives moved closer, their eyes reading the figures, their expressions slowly setting like cement as reality hit them. Janelle, always the one who bore the burden of creating budgets and getting by, felt her gut plunge. For her, it wasn't a number, it was all the nights she lay awake worrying about making their money work. Every cut she had made just to keep the household going. Christine's expression was one of betrayal. After years of being encouraged to give, to make concessions, to trust, she was left wondering if all that trust had been for nothing. And then Kody, even he who had so frequently come to Robyn's defense, was unable to contain his shock. His silence was louder than words. The room constricted, the air thickening with disbelief. No one had to yell, because the impact of what had been revealed was louder than any argument ever could be. And in that silence, everything was transformed. The backlash was quick, and it cut deeper than the debt. It wasn't about the $32,000, though that number hung over everyone's head. It was about the secrecy, the choice to bear something so enormous alone, while everyone else struggled under the suffocating burden of shared sacrifice. The wives had pared down their lives to essentials for years. Janelle was the one who tallied up every bill, stretched every paycheck, and juggled every crisis with near mechanical accuracy. Christine had learned to do with less, making meals from scraps, and gulping disappointment for the sake of family harmony. Even Meri, although often kept emotionally at bay, had foregone luxuries and opportunities simply to keep the family vision alive. To them, Robyn's secret debt was not merely an oversight. It was a violation of the unwritten rule that they all fought together. The outrage didn't burst out in name-calling fights immediately. It raged, like a storm in the making, fueled by pain and disbelief. When Janelle's voice finally lashed out into the silence, it wasn't loud, it was cutting. To her, this was evidence that all her sacrifices had been taken for granted. Christine's disappointment was more emotion than words. It was the expression on her face, the incredulity that this person they had opened themselves up to so fully was able to withhold something so big from them. Kody attempted to step in, to placate the tide that was rising, but his coming to Robyn's defense only added gasoline to the flames. To the other wives, it seemed like déjà vu, Robyn being protected, her flaws glossed over, but their own faults had always been blown out of proportion. The disparity stood out, and in their minds, the debt wasn't Robyn's problem anymore. It was the family's, one more burden added to already cracking backs. And yet, under the rage, a darker question lingered in the background. If Robyn had kept this hidden, how much else was she keeping from them? The debt was a figure on a page, but it had breached something far more sinister. Doubt that anyone was honest. Doubt that anyone would keep their word. Doubt that their so-called merged family was ever really merged at all. That evening, the debt hung like a specter over each look, each breath. The family wasn't gazing at a money issue. They were gazing at the first irrefutable indication that trust had fallen through their grasp. And the storm was only getting started. The foundation. Cracks didn't materialize all at once, slowly they propagated, like hairline fissures in glass. At first, it was the underlying tension that clung to every conversation. The small things that were once dismissed now had sharper edges. Each time bills were mentioned, each time budgets were discussed, it felt like a reminder of Robyn's secret debt, and the resentment that followed. Kody attempted to do the mediator act, the guy who could keep the family together by sheer willpower. But in standing up for Robyn, his words hit a discordant note. To Meri, Janelle, and Christine, it seemed less like leadership and more like favoritism. They had witnessed this dynamic before, Robyn's issues being sympathized with, her needs met first, whereas theirs went unmet. The debt only exaggerated that imbalance, making an old suspicion a stark truth. For practical Janelle, it wasn't about trust anymore. It was about survival. She had battled for years to balance the books, and now felt as if all her work had been undercut. Christine's hurt went even deeper. To her, this wasn't just about money. It was about loyalty. She had invested all in a family she thought was one, and now she wondered whether ever truly they had been a unity. Meri, already separated from the emotional center of the family, felt even more on the outside, from the sidelines observing as the gap between them grew in front of her. And then there was Robyn, at the center of the tempest, both protected and vulnerable. Kody's cover helped ameliorate the blow to her, but it only cut deeper into the others. The debt transformed from a figure, it became a sign of disparity, of shattered trust, of a frayed family beyond fixing. The Browns used to talk about creating something greater than themselves, a vision of oneness and endurance. But now that vision was tenuous, as if it could break under the burden of privilege and disloyalty. The wives questioned, not just Robyn's decisions but the very basis of their polygamous marriage. The cracks were not hidden anymore. They were widening, audible and irrefutable, and the family could feel the earth crumbling under them. But the reality they were on the verge of learning would be even more volatile than the debt itself. For Robyn, the turbulence that swirled around her was both unjust and inevitable. To the other wives, $32,000 appeared to be a sign of recklessness, lack of care, even deception. To Robyn, however, the figure was a wound, carved into her existence years before she had ever been a Brown. She had survived conflicts no other person in that room had experienced. A collapsed marriage, legal troubles, and the sole burden of bringing up children alone. All her choices during that time were survival choices. Decisions to keep a roof over her head and food on the table. The debt was not extravagance or reckless waste. It was the price of trying to construct a life where the cards were against her. When she came into the Brown family, she had held on to the hope of new beginnings. She had hoped that love and commitment would wash away the sins of her past, that her past would not dictate her future. In her heart, she didn't view the debt as something to be hidden sinfully. She viewed it as a past chapter, one that she didn't have to reopen. But when the papers fell onto that table, all her past fears flooded back. The fear of judgment, of rejection, of being labeled as a girl who didn't belong. The sting cut even deeper, because she had worked so hard to prove herself within the family. She had tried to be the peacemaker, the one who soothed tensions when others clashed. And yet, now she was painted as the betrayer. Her silence, in her mind an act of protection, had become the very thing tearing the family apart. Kody's defense comforted her, but it also put her in an even brighter spotlight. Each thing he said on her behalf only seemed to feed the jealousy of the other wives, as if she was being protected once more. In Robyn's mind, it seemed like no matter what she did, she couldn't possibly succeed. If she told them about her past earlier, she might get rejected. By keeping it a secret, she had ensured that, with the accusations revolving around her, one reality stood sharply in focus. This debt was never simply about money. It was about belonging, about trust, about whether her presence in the family would ever be accepted. And for the first time, Robyn found herself questioning whether her role in the Browns' vision of togetherness had been a figment of her imagination all along. The disputes over Robyn's debt raged on for days, sometimes shouted at the top of their lungs, other times in icy silences. But as the dust slowly settled, the family came to understand they weren't battling figures on a page. They were fighting something much more delicate: trust. For Janelle, the epiphany first. She had worked for years building herself into the family's economic pillar, making sacrifices and depriving herself of comforts so that the family could make it through. Now she wasn't only mad at the $32,000. She was mad that the footing she had established had been sabotaged by secrets. To her, the debt was not a past error. It was a violation of trust and the very institution she had sacrificed to keep intact. Christine experienced the betrayal more in her heart than her head. She was the one who always believed in the family dream, trusted in the oneness even when cracks began to appear. But this discovery compelled her to confront a possibility she had long ignored. Perhaps the family wasn't as together as she imagined. If one wife was able to harbor a secret so huge, then what else lay hidden underneath? The debt had become evidence that the dream she held onto was drifting farther away. Meri's reaction was quieter but no less telling. Already distanced emotionally from both Kody and the sister wives, she saw the debt as another confirmation that the family no longer operated as one. Instead of unity, she saw silos, each wife living her own truth, each secret threatening to unravel what little connection remained. And then there was Kody. His defense of Robyn indicated to the others where his allegiance truly was, even if he did not state it. He said that Robyn's history did not wipe away her current, that all of them came with baggage into the marriage. For the other wives, however, his defense rang hollow. It was accusatory. It brought to mind every instance in which Robyn had been given precedence. Every time their own needs had been dismissed. The debt had caused a fight, but what remained after was a lot more burdensome. Could the Browns be a family together if honesty wasn't the norm? Could they mend trust once broken so thoroughly? And if not, then perhaps the vision of one family in one house had been doomed from the very start. In the weeks that ensued, the specter of Robyn's debt never truly departed from the Brown family. Even when not mentioned by word, it hung over the edges of conversations, unspoken but omnipresent. Each look across the dinner table, each casual comment regarding bills or costs, seemed to return to that one figure: 32,000. It was as though the debt had taken on a life of its own, haunting them with every reminder of what had been hidden. Janelle delved deeper into the figures, attempting to find a way forward, but her efforts were empty now. She could balance budgets and shift accounts, but she couldn't compute trust back into the family. The harder she worked to repair the harm on paper, the more she knew this was not an equation to be solved. Christine's sorrow was evident in more subtle manners. She smiled less. She laughed less. Her faith in the family dream, which had once been impenetrable, was now punctuated by uncertainty. She had told herself for years that love and sacrifice would be enough to hold them together. But with each day, she could not help but ask herself if those sacrifices were all in vain. If the unity she struggled for had ever truly been secure, just one secret from shattering. Meri became quieter still, stepping back deeper into the distance she had already created. She saw the others battle, saw the hurt become more keen, and felt more like an outsider than ever. To her, the debt wasn't Robyn's alone. It was another wedge, pushing the family apart. And then there was Robyn herself. Even though she attempted to justify, attempted to couch the debt as a wound from a previous incarnation instead of a willful deceit, the crush of judgment bore down upon her. She was naked, alone, and trapped. Kody's defense should have been her mantle, but in many respects, it only served to isolate her further. The others perceived favoritism in all he said, evidence that Robyn would always be shielded while they bore their loads alone. The debt had become a symbol of betrayal to some, of unfairness to others, and of remorse to Robyn herself. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about the impenetrable walls going up higher between them all. And in the walls, the silence was louder than any argument ever could. There was a point at which the arguments ceased, not because the problems were solved, but because of sheer weariness. The house became still. Words that had flowed freely were now truncated sentences, stilted silences, and an unspoken tension that had a presence like a heavy curtain. The debt had been uncovered, the charges had been leveled, but what remained was worse. Silence. It was amidst the silence that the actual damage was unveiled. Small things, which were once normal, now had meaning. A wife placing her plate on the table without a word. Children perceiving the tension, their laughter fading as they tapped into the gravity that surrounded them. Even Kody, who boasted of being the family anchor, appeared lost, his voice louder in the outside world, but softer at home, as if the walls around him served as constant reminders of the crack. For Janelle, the silence was maddening. She lived for routine, for problem solving, for progress. But this was something she could not repair, no matter how many times she ran her spreadsheets. For Christine, the silence was heartbreaking. She had always been the family's emotional glue, holding it all together with warmth and hope. Now that glue was brittle, cracking beneath the pressure of unspoken disappointment. Meri's silence was different. It was comfortable. She had already withdrawn from the family long before the debt surfaced, and now the quiet seemed to confirm what she already felt, that she was no longer part of the inner circle, no longer needed in the way she once was. And then there was Robyn. She was in the midst of the storm, sensing every look, every hesitation, every unsaid word. Kody's defense had protected her to some degree from the blame, but it had also distanced her more. No amount of clarification could remove the perception that in the eyes of the others, she would always be the outsider, the one whose arrival changed the ratio, the one whose silence had stolen their trust. And yet, in that quiet, something else started to come out. The understanding that this wasn't about Robyn's debt alone. It was about years of hidden resentment, favoritism, and sacrifice. The figure may have begun the storm, but the quiet showed the cracks that had been present all along. And those cracks were only spreading. The peace could only continue for so long. Soon enough, the silence was breached by something louder, more damaging. A financial conflict that spread well past Robyn's secret debt. The family, once united by the notion that they were better together, started to divide into camps. Each discussion regarding finances became a battleground. Each choice, no matter how insignificant, became a war over trust and authority. Janelle, always the pragmatist, insisted on transparency. To her, the solution was simple: ensure that all bills, all debts, all unspoken expenses were laid out. She required order, structure, accountability. But that insistence only widened the gulf. Christine, hurt from years of sacrifice, didn't merely crave transparency, she craved fairness. She craved recognition that her hardships had gone unspoken while others were secretly shielded. Meri, standing at the periphery, looked upon the fight as one more indication of just how broken things were. She wasn't emotionally invested in the financial battle Janelle and Christine were waging, but she was impacted by the ripple effects of each fight. Daily, her estrangement from the family felt less and less a decision, more and more like fate. Kody, stuck in the middle, became more and more defensive. He defined the debt as an error from Robyn's past, something that should not dictate her future. But in so doing, he ignored the deeper hurt of the others. To them, it was not simply about Robyn. It was about patterns of favoritism, of uneven burdens, of one voice being louder than all the others. And Robyn herself, while tired of justifying her history, was cornered repeatedly. She attempted to explain, to remind them that she hadn't had the intention of lying, but her words were a disappointment. Any explanation sounded like an excuse. Any defense like another barrier between her and the others. The debt had been the tinder, but now the blaze grew. Fights about housing, about the children's expenses, about the joint ventures of the family all revolved around that moment when the trust was shattered. What had been a single vision of shared sacrifice had degenerated into a broken group battling over who had sacrificed more, who had taken less, and who had been shielded at the expense of everyone else. And as the brawls grew louder, a single family's dream came to resemble less and less a promise, and instead a fading memory on the horizon. The brawling eventually escalated beyond numbers and bills. What started out as an argument about debt soon became a full-scale battle over loyalty, respect, and even the definition of family. Money was merely the field of battle, but words were the weapons, and they inflicted wounds that cut much deeper than any loss of money. Janelle, ever measured and pragmatic, snapped. Decades of silently shouldering the load finally boiled over, and frustration spilled out in ways she never had permitted herself. To her, the secret debt wasn't just irresponsibility. It was evidence that her sacrifices had gone unseen. All those late nights spent doing math, all those concessions made for the sake of everyone else, now meant nothing. Christine's ire became angrier. She had invested everything in the family, having a vision of togetherness, only to feel like a stranger in her own home. To her, Robyn's debt and Kody's stand on it were not mere incidents. They were signs of a greater betrayal that her love, her patience, her dedication had been taken for granted. The vision of sisterhood that she had held onto seemed to be disintegrating in her own hands. Meri, herself far removed, grew colder. Where before she might have attempted to bridge the gap, now she allowed it to grow ever wider. The debt, the fights, the favoritism, it only cemented the isolation she had already been experiencing. In so many ways, she gave up fighting, withdrawing to a space where detachment was safer than disappointment. Kody, eager to maintain control, became increasingly defensive, his voice raising not only in anger but also in terror. He could sense the ground slipping from beneath him, the power he had exercised so long eroding. But in repeatedly defending Robyn, he inadvertently stoked the very resentment that seemed to destroy all that they had built. And Robyn, stuck in the middle, took the full force of their wrath. All the glares, accusations, and pointed silences were as if directed at her. What she perceived to be wounds of her past the others saw as daggers turned toward their future. She had expected to be understood, but instead was pushed alone, her position in the family more tenuous than ever. The Browns had always thought that their love and trust could endure anything. But during those fiery arguments, during those strain-breaking points, one reality became impossible to deny. Some wounds don't heal. And the question now was whether or not this family had gone past the point of no return. By the time the arguments had climbed to their crest, the Browns were no longer orbiting the debt, they were orbiting one another, making demands that no one seemed ready to fulfill. The air was electric with ultimatums, each one loaded with years of bitterness. It wasn't about who was in debt to whom anymore. It was about who could remain, and who could perhaps walk away for good. Janelle took the first round of talking straight. She explained she could no longer invest her energies in a system that felt shattered. Her voice, which was most often strong and controlled, shook with a mix of anger and fatigue. She wasn't asking for perfection. She was demanding honesty, equality, a family where her sacrifices weren't in the dark. And if that couldn't be guaranteed, she was suggesting what nobody wanted to say aloud. She would have to create a different future for herself. Christine's ultimatum was silent but no less devastating. She had dreamed of love, of unity, of sisterhood, but deep in her heart, she knew those dreams were evaporating. She wondered if she could continue to give so much to a family where she was not seen. The answer was no longer clear. Her words held a bitter truth. Maybe her happiness could never live within these walls. Meri's silence spoke louder than anything. She didn't threaten, didn't demand, didn't bargain. Her detachment had already become its own form of ultimatum. She was still there physically, but emotionally, she had already stepped out, and everyone knew it. Kody, feeling control slipping away, became louder and more adamant. He begged the family's vision, for cohesion, for trust. But each defense of Robyn widened the rift. His words no longer rang with leadership. They rang with desperation. And Robyn, the central woman, felt the walls constricting. She had entered into the family with hope, with visions of acceptance, but now she was being compelled to face the very real possibility that she had hastened the family's disintegration. She craved forgiveness, but in the voices surrounding her, she heard something harder: fatigue, resentment, and skepticism. The Browns had spent years crafting a dream they had thought would withstand anything. But now, with ultimatums suspended in the air, the dream seemed more tenuous than ever. And for the first time, the question wasn't if they could survive together. It was if survival required breaking apart. In the stillness after the storm, the Browns were left standing in front of the fragments of what had been their ideal. The debt had been uncovered. The fights had been battled. The ultimatums been exposed. But remaining was more difficult to confront than any digit inscribed upon paper. Remaining was the silence of a family that could no longer trust itself. For years, they had defined themselves by unity. One family, multiple hearts, held together by faith and determination. But the reality, now inescapable, was that fissures had been growing before the $32,000 arrived on the scene. Robyn's debt had merely ripped off the band-aid, revealing what was hidden underneath: resentment, injustice, isolation, and a loyalty stretched too thin to contain. Janelle withdrew into her practicality, calculating not just bills but futures. Futures where she might stand on her own. Christine found herself searching for happiness outside the shadow of sacrifice, wondering if true love and self-respect could only exist beyond these walls. Meri's silence became permanent, her heart too detached to fight for something that no longer fought for her. Kody, desperate to maintain control, hung on to a vision nobody else appeared to believe in anymore. His justifications of Robyn, formerly presented as love, were now beginning to sound like denial. The fractures within the family were not going to heal, simply because he wanted them to. And Robyn herself, albeit her own past had provided the spark, stood among the embers of a blaze she could not extinguish. Guilt, but also defiance, she bore. The debt to her was no crime, but a scar. But scars, once uncovered, alter perceptions of you forever. Ultimately, the Browns were no longer fighting over dollars. They were looking at the price of secrets, the cost of favoritism, and the harsh truth that sometimes love just isn't enough to hold together a broken family. The one family fantasy hadn't fallen apart in one moment. It had crumbled incrementally, until all it took was one revelation to knock the truth to the ground. And so the question remains, one that the family might never be able to answer fully. Was it indeed Robyn's debt that shattered them? Or were the Browns already coming apart even before the figures ever came up? What do you believe? Was this the breaking point for the dream, or just the confirmation that the dream was already shattered to pieces? The dust may have settled, but the silence that followed was even denser than the brawls that preceded it. For the first time in years, the Browns weren't mapping out a future together. They were sidestepping each other, floating like strangers in the same shared legacy. The family dinners, previously the fulcrum of their identity, became rare. Discussions degenerated into staccato responses, each word having the biting edge of unspoken fault. Robyn attempted to mend the breaks, welcoming people into her home, preparing meals, offering olive branches. But her overtures were greeted with frosty politeness, or solid absence. Each smile she forced was accompanied by the knowledge that her presence had become synonymous with division, instead of unity. The burden of $32,000 no longer existed on paper. It existed in each look, each silence, each early closed door at night. Janelle, ever practical, started working on independence. She learned about money, re-evaluated her investments, and envisioned what solidity would be like without the perpetual uncertainty of pooled debt. She loved the family still, but directed her energy towards safeguarding herself and her kids. Her unobtrusive remoteness was eloquent testimony. She would no longer bear more than her share. Christine was in an even more intimate fight. For years, she had dreamed of love, of being noticed, of the sense that her sacrifices counted for something. But the more she went over the fights in her mind, the more she knew those dreams had long since evaporated. Her laughter, once something that brightened the family's darkest moments, became less and less frequent. And when it did arrive, it frequently came outside family boundaries, with friends, with her children, in moments not related to Kody. Meri, on the other hand, had mastered the technique of being there without really being present. She was in the same rooms, nodded when addressed, and melted into silence. Her absence was rebellion enough. She didn't scream, didn't fight, didn't insist. She simply refused to bleed for a family that didn't really see her. And Kody, still holding on to his dream, but confronting the reality that his words did not mean what they once had. Always the center of gravity, Now the orbit was splitting apart. Frustration boiled into fury, fury into isolation. A leader with no followers is merely a man yelling into the vacuum. And Kody was starting to feel that loneliness. The Browns were still intact in name, but in reality, the disintegration had already started. And if this was what silence was like, what would the tempest of divorce bring later? The silence could only persist for so long before reality reared its head once again. The Browns weren't merely a family, they were a family under scrutiny, a tale televised for the world to watch. And whereas the cameras had once been their pulpit for rejoicing in unity, they now were a mirror of every crack, every unspoken hurt, every whispered question. Behind the scenes, the producers felt the change. What was once a story of resilience had become a drama of disintegrating loyalties. And the cameras lingered on the strained silences, the practiced smiles, the places between the words. The Browns had constructed a life intended to demonstrate that plural marriage could flourish. But what the world was starting to see was not strength. It was collapse in slow motion. Robyn was right back in the middle of the storm, not because of what she spoke, but because of how others perceived her. Each decision she made, each shopping trip, each look at Kody, each try to bond with the rest, was brought into the fray on charges of favoritism and betrayal. To some, she was the interloper who had upset the scales. To others, she was just a woman struggling to find her own niche in a family that had been on shaky ground before she came along. Janelle's independence became more apparent. She ceased attempting to make anyone believe she was still committed to the same fantasy. Rather, she started expressing a soft conviction regarding the life she could create for herself and her children. She wasn't upset anymore. She was determined, and that determination meant more than any argument ever could. Christine, as well, had the draw of freedom. Her desire for happiness beyond these doors wasn't a hidden thing anymore. She talked about joy, laughter, love in a manner that indicated she no longer thought those were things that could happen within the family. It was not so much a threat, but a declaration. She would no longer dig herself underground in silence. Meri was a specter among them, going through the same motions, speaking only when required. But each day her silence became louder, her withdrawal more absolute. And Kody, needing to keep together a family that was already disintegrating, continued to insist on possibility, even as every indication around him cried otherwise. The more he fought, the more the others retreated. The Browns had always thought their tale would be one of proving the world wrong, but now, the tale being told before cameras was one of breakdown, and no editing could veil the truth. And if the world was indeed paying attention, how much longer could they continue to feign what they no longer were? The Browns had always thought that they controlled their own tale. From their very first episode, they came across as a family united by religion and by choice, prepared to weather the condemnations of a world that didn't know they needed Jesus. But now, the rumors at their doorstep were getting louder, and this time they weren't the soft murmurs of interest. They were whispers of judgment, of ridicule, of disillusionment. Online discussions rumbled with rumors. Fans analyzed every exchange, every look, every non-appearance at the dinner table. The $32,000 announcement wasn't a personal emergency anymore. It was a headline, a meme, a talking point. What the Browns had considered their strength, their willingness to live their lives on camera, was now their biggest weakness. Robyn, who was already burdened with suspicion in the family, was now publicly condemned. Strangers accused her of being manipulative, calculating, the wedge that destroyed the Browns. She attempted to tune it out, but these words seeped into her mind at night, repeating the same words she had heard from the other wives. No longer was it just her family who questioned her. It was the world. Janelle felt the external din differently. She wasn't resentful of the judgment. She was worn down by it. The ceaseless attention, the constant inquiries, the necessity of having to defend a family that no longer seemed complete. She couldn't help but question whether relinquishing it wouldn't liberate her from inner turmoil, but also from the spotlight that had tailed her for so long. Christine, by contrast, found surprising strength within the din. For the first time, she heard voices outside the family agreeing with what she had secretly believed all along, that she was worthy of happiness, that her sacrifices were not in vain, that her heart was worthy of healing. What previously felt like loneliness, now felt like vindication. And with vindication came a treacherous clarity. Perhaps the world wasn't against her. Perhaps the world was finally aligned with hers. Kody, though, couldn't stomach the shame. All those stories, all those posts on social media, every camera angle capturing tension over harmony, it was all a betrayal to him. He attacked producers, the wives, anyone who would say that the Browns' fairy tale had fallen apart. And the more he hollered, the more apparent the reality was. Control was eroding, not only within his own household, but in the eyes of everyone watching. The Browns had previously opened their doors to demonstrate that love could be multiplied. Now the same open doors were a window for the world to see them follow Nuna. And if the world outside was already determining their narrative, the Browns had to confront a chilling question: would they write their own ending, or would it be written about them?